That advice came from a couple of case studies. One was, I think, a hiker in the Grand Canyon from memory, and one was an ultra runner who both ended up in hospital with hyponatremia. In the wash up or the review of those cases, both of them reported consuming quite a bit of sodium before they got into trouble.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and it's episode 2 of our review of sodium intake for athletes before, during, and after exercise. In episode 2, Dr. Alan McCubbin and myself discuss the following areas related to sodium. So, does sodium impact gastrointestinal emptying or fluid retention in relation to sodium and carbohydrate? Does it increase thirst drive and therefore increase fluid intake rate? Does sodium prevent exercise-associated muscle cramps, which is a big one? And then also, does sodium intake prevent a fall in blood sodium concentration and therefore the onset of exercise-associated hyponatremia? And lastly, is sodium replacement exercise performance enhancing? And on the final or the back end of all of that, what we're going to do is go through what we would do or how you can think about your sodium replacement in relation to fluid replacement. It's a cracking episode, lots of in-depth discussions, and certainly a lot of practical takeaways. So sit back and enjoy. Al, how you doing, mate?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. Looking forward to getting into this one. It's a big one.
Yeah, look, big one. This is episode 2 of a 3-part series diving into sodium. And we're back. This is episode 2, sodium for athletes. And the paper we're discussing is your very own paper titled Sodium Intake for Athletes Before, During, and After Exercise, Review and Recommendations. It is found in Performance Nutrition. It is an all-access free paper. The link is in the show notes. Mate, this paper received a lot of social media attention from practitioners, researchers, athletes, and coaches, mainly because it clearly laid out what is belief versus what does the current research show us. The simplicity, the ease of reading made it really relevant and practical for everyone to access and get their head around sodium intake, first and foremost. So I think firstly, congrats, because so much research sits on the shelves and only geeks and people who enjoy reading research tend to actually ever see the light of day. So I think first, the fact that it was on mainstream social media probably showed that you'd done something pretty good, I think. So congrats to you. Like in episode 1, where we delved into daily or habitual intake of sodium and its use or probably lack of, and then before exercise where sodium can be beneficial for certain circumstances for athletes. I want to again paraphrase a sentence from the paper because I think it is really important. And what you said was replacement of sweat sodium during exercise is one aspect of sodium intake that has the most strongly held beliefs amongst athletes. And where I'm going to add in is I'll also say coaches, practitioners, and companies selling electrolytes. Why do you think this is such a firmly held belief?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think as long as I've been in the profession, a bit over 20 years now, that has been the case. I think a lot of it is because, and we talked about it a bit in the last episode, there's been a real lack of quite specific guidelines around sodium before, during, and after exercise for athletes. And again, that's not a criticism of anyone who wrote the guidelines. It's been due to a lack of research in the area. And inevitably, if there's a lack of research in an area and a lack of guidance, there's going to be a bit of a knowledge vacuum, and something is inevitably going to fill that vacuum. And so a lot of what has filled that vacuum has been messages by people who want to sell electrolyte products, essentially. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that. We'll get into, there is a reason for sodium. So it's not to say that, no one should ever buy electrolyte products or anything like that at all. But they have to come up with some sort of message. And in the lack of evidence, someone had to create something. So that's what happened. And I think, with athletes, we tend to get, or, the general public, whether it's nutrition or anything else in life, we have what's called anchor bias, which is basically that we tend to believe the first thing we hear about a topic, and any new information that contradicts that sort of gets applied through a much greater level of scrutiny before we discard the original belief. So I think that's where a lot of it has come from historically when it comes to things like sodium and cramping, which we'll get into, but sodium in general.
Yeah, and just on that point, Al, I think that is a really good point to make for this episode and the whole series, these 3 shows on sodium, is like people will have firmly held beliefs. And I think any good practitioner and hopefully any good athlete should be open to changes in beliefs based on what research, both past, present, and future research will show us. And I can think of a number of sort of, nutrition topics where my views have changed over the years as, research has become more readily available. I think some of us do things prior to the research coming out. I think of carbohydrate. I remember getting told I was mad recommending over 100 grams of carbs per hour to a 55-kilo professional female athlete at the time. But, things change and we don't always get it right. There's probably times where we've recommended things as well that we look back and go, God, why were we doing that? So I think all I'd say for these episodes is have an open mind. Think about what we're talking about, what the research shows or doesn't show, and also listening to Al in terms of potential for future research and what that might show us and hopefully help us with. So same way we did episode 1, we're going to go through the paper in terms of how you laid out the rationales of why certain aspects of sodium intake during exercise might be applied or not applied based on the research. So rationale 1, a specific sodium concentration enhances gastrointestinal fluid and or carbohydrate absorption. Can you explain this one, Al, in terms of, where does it come from?
So this is something that you probably don't see or hear around as much anymore. Certainly when I started my career 20 years ago, this was quite a common thing, that there was this belief that, a sports drink had to be a certain sodium concentration because that was necessary to improve how quickly you could absorb or how completely you could absorb fluid from the gut during exercise. And I think where it comes from sort of mechanistically is that we have the absorption of glucose, we have the absorption of sodium and the absorption of water, and they're kind of interconnected through what's called the sodium glucose transporter 1 in the gut. And so because there's this kind of interdependence between these 3 in terms of absorption, I think that's where that sort of the rationale originally came from. And I think the second part of that is that, if we think historically, if you go back even 10 years, but probably 15, a lot of the focus around, drinks that you're having during exercise, whether it's water, whether it's electrolytes, whether it's sports drinks or whatever, the focus was very much around how can we get as much fluid into the body as quickly as possible from a hydration perspective. The focus was very much on the hydration and the carbohydrate was kind of taking a back seat a little bit. But that's really kind of flipped in the last 10 years or so because, as you said before, this move towards higher carbohydrate fueling. So people are much more about, well, how could we get the carbohydrate in? Yes, we need the fluid. That's still important. But we need to prioritize the carbohydrate as well as the fluid rather than focusing on fluid first and then worry about the carbs later kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. And so when we look at specific sodium concentrations and does it impact, fluid absorption, what does the research show us?
Yeah, so a lot of the early studies were quite mechanistic. So they put like feeding tubes down into the first part of the small intestine and then feed, different mixes in there and see what happens. There are some issues with that. It's quite reductionist. It's only looking at one little part of the small intestine because you can't get a feeding tube the whole way through. It also bypasses the stomach and the effect that stomach emptying of whatever you're eating or drinking is going to have in that whole process as well. So probably the best study we have was published in 2009. And they used deuterium, which is if people have heard of doubly labeled water, you have both the hydrogen and the oxygen labeled. The labeled hydrogen part is deuterium, so you can use just that part rather than doubly labeled water to track how water moves through the body. So they gave people a drink that had the deuterium in it, and then they could take blood samples and see how long it took for that deuterium to appear in the blood, basically, so how quickly that fluid's ending up in the blood from the time you swallow it. And so they had drinks that were a 6% carbohydrate mix, which is kind of your classic traditional sports drink sort of concentration of carbohydrate, and then varying concentrations of sodium from no sodium at all to much higher amounts. I think there was 4 or 5 different concentrations from memory, and then they would measure this uptake. And basically what they saw was that increasing the sodium concentration in the drink made no impact on how quickly or slowly it was absorbed from the gut.
Yeah, okay. So effectively what athletes can just take from that is that you don't need to have a specific sodium concentration to improve absorption.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. And it prevents sort of complicating things in terms of, based on my sodium losses, I'm trying to get this much sodium, but is that conflicting with trying to get the uptake from the gut? So you don't have to consider these two things and try to compromise between the two of them. You can just focus on that first one that we'll get to shortly.
Yep. And then the second part of this, which I thought, you just mentioned, like the focus has sort of changed from huge amounts of fluid and focusing on fluid absorption to actually carbohydrate absorption. What do we know about sodium concentration on glucose uptake? Because you mentioned like those SGLT1, low sodium glucose transporter 1, and everyone will focus on that. But what do we know about high or differing concentrations of sodium and its impact on glucose absorption?
So basically, once the glucose concentration becomes to the level that you would traditionally have in your sports drinks, like your 6% or higher, and even if you're having those lower or the carb-free electrolyte drinks and things like that, if you're then having gels and things, it's all going to mix in the stomach anyway. And the research that has been done in this suggests that by the time you sort of put all that stuff together mathematically, most people, that mix is sort of closer to 20% than 6% by the time you add all the bits together. At those sort of concentrations, the sodium doesn't seem to make a difference. The only time it does make a difference is at much lower sodium concentrations, which basically means you would be having a really low carb intake. Really low glucose concentration. So you're having a really low carb intake. And even then, the amount of sodium that you would need to have an effect is quite high. It's over about 115 milligrams of sodium per 100 mils of fluid, or 1,150 milligrams per litre, essentially, that you would need to achieve that effect. And once you start getting up to those kind of levels, you start running into problems where people go, the drink doesn't taste great as well.
Yeah, so effectively, I mean, what you're saying when I hear that is if someone was pretty much taking in very little carbs, but then taking in fairly high amounts of sodium, it may have an impact on that very low carbohydrate intake. Yep. Yet in a practical situation, in a race, you wouldn't anticipate anyone taking in low carbohydrate. Well, hopefully not. Certainly no fuel in athlete. They'd be taking in good amounts of carbohydrates based on their power output, and therefore the sodium intake, whether it was moderate, low, moderate, or high, maybe really high, is not going to really have an impact on glucose
Correct.
Absorption.
Yeah.
Okay. So the end of the day, for rationale 1, specific sodium concentration doesn't really have an impact on fluid absorption, and it probably doesn't have much of an impact on carbohydrate absorption if carbohydrate absorption is in a level that is probably what would be recommended for race performance. So we can sort of knock that one off. Okay.
Yeah.
Rationale 2, sodium increases thirst drive and ad libitum fluid intake, or fluid intake as and when you feel like drinking. Can you explain how this one makes sense theoretically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this comes back to what we were talking about in the first episode. Obviously, we were talking about that before exercise, but the same is to a degree true during exercise. So it's that kind of those pretzels are making me thirsty analogy that we use. So if you take in a lot of sodium, that tends to increase the amount of sodium relative to fluid, depending on how concentrated that sodium is, or if it's in capsules or food versus in a drink. And if it increases the osmolality, so the total number of dissolvable particles in the blood relative to water, that will trigger our brain to produce more antidiuretic hormone, which will reduce the production of urine to conserve water, but it also increases our sensation of thirst. So that's kind of physiologically driven thirst, if you like, from the sodium actually getting into the blood. Now, the other one that's been theorized is possibly that there's also an effect somewhere in the gastrointestinal tract, and that's anywhere from the tongue all the way down to probably the small intestine. Whether that's the taste of salty food triggering a response directly to the brain. We know glucose, for example, could do that. We know caffeine can be absorbed through the mouth, or possibly there's some other effect further down the chain, whether anything there has an effect as well, and that may play out in terms of differences between, say, consuming salt capsules versus salt in the drink. Yeah, there's two mechanisms why maybe the sodium could increase thirst.
Okay, thanks for that, Al. Like we discussed in episode 1, we talked about, as you mentioned there, like intake of sodium in rest or before exercise. But why is it important to distinguish between rest and activity research studies when it comes to sodium increasing thirst drive?
Yeah, two different things. The first one, from a physiological point of view, is that as we're exercising, if we're sweating, assume we're not replacing anything at this stage, water or sodium, our blood sodium concentration is going to rise. So the reason for that is that as we exercise and we start to sweat, we're losing water, yes, we're losing sodium, yes, but our body actually, or the sweat glands, recapture some of the sodium. They don't recapture any of the water. And so what that means is our sweat is always less salty than our blood. And so we're taking proportionally more water from the blood than sodium. And so our blood sodium concentration rises as we exercise and become dehydrated. So because that's happening, we're already getting this natural drive to drink more, this increase in thirst during exercise if we did nothing anyway. And so that's different to rest, where you're adding sodium, but you're not sweating at all. So you're increasing the blood sodium concentration because nothing's coming out the other end. So that's the physiological part of it. I guess the other part of it is that fluid intake is more than just physiology. It's a behavior, and it depends on a lot of different factors, not just sense of thirst. It depends on the availability of fluid, the palatability of fluid, possibly the temperature of the fluid. It depends on our beliefs around hydration, all sorts of different things. And obviously they're all going to be quite different. That context is completely different during exercise to what it is before exercise as well.
Yeah, very more complex than probably people give it credit for in that sense. Certainly a lot of moving parts. So we're going to specifically talk about during exercise and sodium increases thirst drive and potentially intake of fluid as a result. The ultra endurance community have fairly specific advice to avoid aggressive sodium intake. Can you explain why this may be unwarranted, or where it at least comes from?
So yeah, that advice came from a couple of case studies. One was, I think, a hiker in the Grand Canyon from memory, and one was an ultra runner who both ended up in hospital with hyponatremia. And sort of in the, I won't say post-mortem because they survived, but in the wash up or the review of those cases, both of them reported consuming quite a bit of sodium before they got into trouble. And so the thinking at the time with those case studies was, if they consumed a lot of fluid, did that make them too thirsty? And then they overdrank fluid as a result of that. And because they overdrank fluid, ironically, they then diluted their blood sodium and ended up with hyponatremia and fluid overload as a result.
Sorry, you were saying that they overconsumed sodium.
Yeah, that was the... that was the report in the case studies. All of this was done, of course, retrospectively after the people ended up in hospital. So it was based on the people recalling what they'd consumed, which
is always, fraught with danger. It's just interesting that, and we'll get into what the research shows us at the moment, but it's interesting that such an a blanket statement can be made from a couple of case studies to warn against sort of aggressive, sodium. It's not saying don't take in any sodium. It's just more warning against aggressive sodium intake. And I guess what is the definition of aggressive sodium intake? Is that replacing sodium at 90% of your losses, 100%, or is it actually above what, over 100% of what your losses are? So what does the research and the evidence show us to date on, say, sodium intake and driving thirst? Just a couple of examples, if you've got them.
Yeah, so there's been a few studies looking, that can answer this question. They weren't sort of setting out deliberately to answer this question, but because of their design, they kind of lend themselves towards being able to work that out. Most of them have been done in relatively cool conditions using sodium in capsules versus placebo capsules. And most of them either set out to study sodium and performance, which we'll get into shortly, or they were done for some other reason around sort of hyponatremia or something like that, rather than actual voluntary fluid consumption. And it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them show increased fluid intake that was statistically significant when people had the sodium capsules. Some don't really show much difference. When they do show differences, the differences are typically anywhere from like 150 mils up to about 250 mils an hour difference. So it's not massive. It's not like they're tripling their fluid intake or anything like that. But there is some difference. I did a study published in 2023 where we wanted to take those case studies and the kind of the messaging that was coming from those and really look at that a bit more intensely. So we actually had people running on the treadmill for 5 hours in 30-degree heat, and we gave them
quite unbelievable. Say. Like getting anyone to run for 5 hours continuously in 30-degree heat on a treadmill in winter.
Yes.
Fair play to them, and fair play to you and Ricardo for managing to pull this off.
Yeah, it took us, COVID sort of interrupted the middle of it, but it took us about 5 years not quite 4 years, I think, to recruit 9 people for this study. So yeah, it was a bit of a slog. But yeah, that was, had a few firsts in that study. One of them was it was the first study ever published that actually personalized the sodium replacement based on their expected losses. So we actually sweat tested them a week or two before the 5 hour run.
How did you do the sweat testing?
Oh, with patches. So they're kind of standard lab technique.
And was that on the forehead? Is that where you?
Forearm and the thigh.
Forearm and thigh. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And so we used that to work out what we would expect their sodium losses to be during the 5 hour run. And then we could provide either 100% of that or 0% of that in placebo capsules. So they did that 5 hour run twice. We looked at a whole bunch of different things during those studies, but in the context of fluid behavior and drinking, we were looking at what we call ad libitum fluid intake. So basically, we would give them fluid that they could choose to drink as much or as little as they want, and we could actually measure the difference. One reason why our finding might be a little bit different to the other studies that have been done is that actually the way we set up that fluid intake was, I guess, what I would probably call a little bit more real world. That was partly because running for 5 hours, we wanted to ensure they got enough carbs that they could actually make the 5 hours and not conk out beforehand. So we had to give them sort of an amount of fluid that would allow them to get the carbohydrate in. So that was like a fixed volume of fluid. It was quite small. It was only about, I think off the top of my head, 250 or 300 mils an hour. That was a fixed amount that they would always drink every hour no matter what, and that got the carbs in. And then in addition to that, we would give them plain water that they could drink as much or as little of, in addition to obviously the capsules they were taking as well. And that's much more the way athletes tend to actually plan their fluid in a race. They have a certain amount that's delivering carbohydrate, and then they have an amount that's flexible to go up and down depending on the conditions on the day, how thirsty they are, etc. So I think it is probably a bit more a real-world reflection.
Yeah, I just jump in on that because I think when I read the study, I was like, oh, that's interesting because, if an athlete is going to choose to use carbohydrates in fluid form on, say, the run, then you've got to take into account you don't want them overdoing that because they're probably going to overdo the fluid amount because they're probably going to want to drink some water at the same time and use water to then top up on their fluid requirements based on either a known sweat rate and trying to do their best to, replace a percentage of that, which we'll get into later. And so I think it is exactly what runners will do in the real world situation, which I think is important in the context of what the research or what the outcomes of this study actually showed. So do you want to just give us what did you see in terms of the fluid intake versus in the 100% replaced sodium based on their specific sweat sodium concentration measurements versus those that didn't have that done?
Yeah. So we also measured their perception of thirst, and there was no difference in their perception of thirst, whether they got the sodium capsules or the placebo capsules. And there was no difference or no statistically significant difference in the amount of fluid they drank. So the difference was, I think with the sodium capsules, on average, they drank about 70 mils an hour more, but it wasn't statistically significantly different because some people drank a lot more, some people drank actually less. But on average, the amount wasn't statistically greater.
Yeah, which I think did that catch you by surprise? Did you think going into it, your hypothesis was that it would drive more fluid intake?
Yeah. So we were a little bit surprised by that. And I think probably having that split fluid approach is maybe why the differences are smaller than what you see with the other studies where they just took the sodium capsules and just allowed to drink as much or as little as water with no fixed amount. So in those scenarios, they do tend to drink a bit more, but in our scenario, they didn't. So, some people do tend to split their carbohydrate and fluid completely and run them completely independently of each other and only get carbohydrates from gels and food and things and then use fluid just for fluid and sodium. So it depends on how you do it. But, generally speaking, we didn't see an effect.
Yeah. It's always like, on the bike, would you use fluids? On the run, do you use gels or do you have access to fluids? I think I certainly lean more into fluids these days, actually, because I just think it's easier to get in, and especially if they're moving really fast. I guess it depends on the athlete, again, personal choice, all those things. But I think the takeaway from this rationale is that, yes, sodium intake can impact that, the thirst drive and make you drink a little bit more through osmotic thirst drive, certainly for longer events, yet maybe shorter events, it's more driven by palatability. I think the key thing here is that the sodium amount, it's relative to the fluid amount, isn't it? That's probably the key driver here, is that the amount of fluid. And again, I think where we've talked about this in the past is you could take in, let's go back to that aggressive sodium intake. Okay, is aggressive just replacing 100%? Maybe not. But the mistake we've seen with athletes in the past is they thought they were taking in 100%, but they were taking in, let's call it 1,000 milligrams per hour because they were told that they had 1,000 milligrams per liter loss, but they're only replacing 500 mils per hour. Suddenly they're taking in 2,000 milligrams, the equivalent, per hour. And that's where the issues, I think, and then they have a terrible race. And that's where I think a lot of the issues can come from excessive sodium intake as opposed to underdoing the sodium intake.
So I think, sometimes people get into trouble with like salt capsules and things like that because they just take way too much. So they're actually replacing more than 100% of their sodium losses in the first place, even regardless of what they're doing with their fluid. And there's no world in which we would recommend that. And in fact, we'll get into it shortly, I don't think there's any situation where you even need to replace 100% of your sodium losses. So, that's what we did in the study, more just because you want to examine the two extremes of 100% and 0%. So coming back to what you're saying before, does excessive sodium intake encourage excessive water intake? Well, certainly not at 100% loss. Maybe if it was 300% sodium replacement, then it might, but certainly not at 100% replacement. And I guess the second part of that, and it comes back to, I think, what's a bit of a chicken and egg question is, like, do you plan the sodium intake to drive thirst to encourage more fluid intake to improve your hydration, or do you plan your hydration to whatever you want it to be and then basically use the sodium as kind of the partner or the supporting act to kind of balance things out? I guess it's a bit of a philosophical discussion, and it might depend a little bit on the person as well. But kind of two different ways of approaching it.
Yeah, and we're certainly at the end of these rationales. We're going to go through, certainly your thoughts on how do we prescribe sodium intake during exercise and what are the key things for athletes and practitioners and coaches to think about when they are talking to an athlete or you're planning your own sodium intake. So, okay. Rationale 3, sodium prevents and or treats exercise-associated muscle cramping. This is a big one. Everyone gets super passionate about cramping and that sodium either does or doesn't prevent it. Firstly, can you explain what we know about cramps or don't know and the possible reasons for cramps and how sodium may or may not impact this?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say here is there's still an awful lot we don't know about cramping. It's actually really hard to study. So you see online a lot of people making these blanket statements about this and that and cramping like it's, we know everything there is to know about cramping. That's absolutely not the case. And the reason is cramping is unpredictable. You can't just bring people into the lab and say, okay, well, when I count to 5, can you just cramp for me and I'll measure whatever it is I need to measure. So it doesn't work like that. So we have different ways of studying it, models where we get people to either just give them a lot of muscle damage, do downhill treadmill running for a couple of hours, or we can electrically stimulate the muscle to contract until basically it can't contract anymore and it starts to spasm and things like that. So there are ways of doing it, but they're not really real world. So that does make it difficult. I guess where we're at the moment from a cramping point of view, is maybe a little bit of convergence. There's always been this kind of polarized view of cramping. It's all about water and electrolytes, or it's nothing to do with water and electrolytes. It's all about neuromuscular fatigue and things like that. And that has kind of come together a little bit in the last sort of 5 years or so. And we now have this kind of complex model, hypothetical model of cramping that was published, I think first published in a textbook in maybe 2021 and then published in a journal in 2022. And that's put together by Professor Kevin Miller from Texas State University and a bunch of other authors as well. And basically what they describe cramping is it's a complex syndrome. So basically there can be different causes of cramping. We think of cramping as one thing with one cause. But what they show with their model is that probably there's lots of different ways to arrive at the same outcome, or an outcome that looks the same to the athlete. That the cause of cramping can be different in different people. The causes of cramping could be different in the same person on different days as well. And there's a lot of different factors that could go into this. Some of them are around sort of muscular fatigue and feedback from the muscle to the nervous system. Some of it can be around excitability of the nervous system itself. And there's a whole bunch of factors. A lot of them have nothing to do with nutrition whatsoever that play into this. So yes, there may be a role for sodium and fluid balance in here, but at best it's probably a minor role.
Yeah, and the other nutritional aspects was carbohydrate intake, wasn't it? And then
correct
fluid balance.
Yep.
And I think that's where it makes it, again, coming back to the gray area of nutrition. It's well, let's not just hang our hats on one thing, everyone. In the case of cramping, it is a complex syndrome, if that's what we're going to call it, where it's actually unknown what causes it. But if you address all the factors, or as best you can, the factors that can be addressed, especially from a nutrition perspective, then you probably end up reducing the risk of those cramps occurring. And I always think of the athlete okay, we may use sodium. We may start to increase a little bit of sodium in their intake on a per litre basis. But most importantly, from my perspective, is we actually address their fluid balance. We get their fluid balance right, not overdoing it, not underdoing it, but just in line with what their sweat rate testing is. And then probably most importantly, they all seem to increase their carbohydrate intake as well. And so is it the carb intake? Is it the fluid balance? Is it the sodium? Is it probably a combination of all three? Yeah. Actually
and a whole bunch of other stuff.
And a whole bunch of other. And like you said, strength. Maybe because they're not cramping all the time, they're able to train a little bit more, and that adds to the whole, neuromuscular side of the equation. So,
yep, there's a whole bunch of biomechanical stuff. It can be bike fit, it could be running shoes or running technique. It could be
so many things. So many things. So, okay, so the end of the day, there is some evidence, would you say, that sodium may play a role in the prevention of exercise associated muscle cramps?
Yes and no. There is a lot of it's been in the context of sort of dehydration in the past, or just a loss of sodium from the body, that if you lose too much sodium from the body, something bad is going to happen.
Because you referenced the 1930s, don't you? I mean, that's where it goes back. That's where that all comes from, isn't it? Just explain the 1930s sort of.
So a lot of this research, from my understanding, was around workers that were building the Hoover Dam in the 20s and 30s. And what they discovered was that a lot of them would cramp, and they were obviously in hot conditions, working pretty hard, sweating a lot. And then once they started adding sodium or salt to what they were drinking, that reduced the risk of cramping. So people said it was a sodium depletion issue. Retrospectively looking at that, and some researchers have done that, probably what was happening is these people were actually developing mild hyponatremia because they were sweating a lot, replacing a lot of water over time, and actually diluting the sodium in the blood. So it wasn't necessarily that they were losing too much sodium from the body, quote unquote, but it was the sodium relative to the water in the body that was the issue. And once they started adding some sodium back, that was less of an issue. That probably fits with sort of more modern research that we see, if anything, dehydration, where your blood sodium concentration rises. But so this is a situation where the amount of sodium in the body has gone down, but the concentration of sodium in the blood relative to water has gone up. So your blood is saltier, but you have less salt in the body in total. And in that situation, actually cramping seems less likely. The flip side to that is if you overdrink during exercise and you develop hyponatremia, you actually are more likely to cramp. It's a risk factor for cramping itself. There has been a little bit of research that's kind of played around with this, where if someone becomes dehydrated, so their blood sodium goes up, and then they drink a lot of water to replace that fluid deficit, whether that's plain water or contained sodium, seems to maybe make a difference. But it's still very early days, I'd say, for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it comes back. I just, every time I hear these statements, and when you talk about this, it always comes back to sort of the fluid amount. It seems to always come back to the fluid amount first and foremost, and then the sodium.
And the relationship between sodium and water.
Correct. That's where, as you said, like you could be hyponatremic and developing cramps, but a lot of people would be thinking, oh, you're dehydrated, you need to drink more. And that's the real risk there, isn't it? Where, suddenly someone's drinking over-consuming fluid, even though they've already over-consumed fluid as a result of, their clinical sign is that they're cramping. And so a lot of people, especially people on the sidelines, will start throwing water at them saying, hey, drink this, you're cramping, you're dehydrated. And it's actually not the case.
And there's a whole bunch of stuff we still don't know about any of this. So, for example, is it the low blood sodium that's the problem? Is it the volume of fluid that's the problem? Is it the shift of water from the outside of the cells rapidly moving to the inside of the cells that causes the problem? Is it the size of the cells that swell up that is the problem? We don't know any answers to any of those questions.
Yeah. So what, before we get into the hyponatremia and the role of sodium with that, what do you recommend to your athletes when it comes to cramps?
Yeah. Really a comprehensive look at things from every possible angle. And there's lots of possible angles to look at it from. As I said before, there's things like biomechanics, there's things like body temperature regulation, there's things like sleep, there's things like anxiety, pre-race nerves, or stress during a race. All of these things theoretically could have a role to play in this that have nothing to do with nutrition as well. For running athletes, it can even be the surface that you run on. How hard or soft is the surface that you run on, and does that change over the year? I've worked, this is probably more a team sport example, but I've worked with a few organizations doing some case reviews of people with cramping. And in the end, we concluded that the reason they were cramping at a certain time of the year was actually that the playing surface, how hard the playing surface was, changed from one end of the season to the other based on the rainfall and how hot or cold it was at different times of the year. And that seemed to be their main risk factor for this person cramping. So there's lots of different things. And the problem with these syndromes is you can change one thing at a time and try and be specific. It's the same with gut issues. And nothing happens because there were multiple contributors. So only changing one doesn't have an appreciable effect. So you've literally got to address as many of these things simultaneously as you possibly can, and then see what effect it may or may not have.
Yeah, and it's funny actually working with you over the years. I probably used to have a bit more of a like, let's implement one thing at a time type approach. Um, but actually, yeah, I've gone more the other way now. Is like, let's throw everything at it, and in the end, the outcome is more important maybe than me understanding exactly why, and maybe you'll never understand why. But like, if I can reduce that athlete from cramping, well, that's the best thing that can happen. Now, whether it is because of fluid balance, sodium intake, carbohydrates, muscular strength, biomechanics, blah blah blah, surfaces, yeah, doesn't really matter. I mean, then I guess you can start to reduce some of those interventions that you've applied, and then if the cramping comes back, you start to go, oh, well, maybe that was it. But yeah, I'm definitely more of a fan of throwing everything at it and addressing everything at once and trying to do it as quickly as possible now than sort of one at a time. So yeah.
I think the key thing there is just to appreciate that there's not one cause. And so if you're looking for one cause and changing one thing at a time, you're probably never going to find it because you're looking for something that doesn't exist.
And I think that's a really good takeaway for everyone in regard to this rationale, is that just changing your sodium intake, if you cramp, may or may not have any impact on it at all, because it is so multifactorial. So rather, if you are going to change your sodium intake, probably have a look at your fluid intake, your carbohydrate intake, your training, your shoes, your biomechanics, everything else, and address it all at once, rather than just hanging your hat on a supplement.
And anecdotally, that's what we see. You know, some people say, oh, sodium's the miracle cure. It worked for me. They'll tell everyone who wants to listen. And other people say, what nonsense, is complete rubbish. I changed my sodium. I went ridiculously high, ridiculously low, somewhere in the middle. It made absolutely no difference whatsoever. And this is probably why.
And I just, without harping on about this, I can imagine those who do change their sodium intake, they probably inadvertently don't just change their sodium intake. They probably do actually, you know, if we think of let's mention a company like Precision. Okay, they're probably taking in more sodium, but they're probably also taking in hopefully some of their gels and carbs. And then also, because they're made aware of fluid intake, they're actually doing that. And that's sort of fits, you know, perfectly with what we recommend at Fuel In as well. Like, let's address, you know, your energy availability. Let's address your fluid availability, and then make adjustments according to that. So, yeah. Okay. Rationale 4, which you sort of started alluding to there, hyponatremia. It's what a lot of people talk about. So rationale 4 was preventing a fall in blood sodium concentration and onset of exercise-associated hyponatremia. I think firstly, just describe and define hyponatremia for us, Al, because I know it is. Why is it such a concern for athletes?
Yeah, well, I mean, the word is relatively simple enough. Hypo means low, nat means sodium, and emia means in the blood. So basically low blood sodium concentration. And the concentration is the important part there. It's the sodium relative to the water. So it's how many, we describe it in millimoles, but you could do it in milligrams if you wanted to, of sodium per litre of fluid in the blood, basically. Now, when we talk about hyponatremia, that's the way it's defined. It's a blood sodium concentration that's below kind of the standard reference range, I guess, if you like, and generally the lower it goes, or the faster it goes down, the more problematic it is. But the name itself is potentially a little bit misleading in that the consequences of hyponatremia are not specific to the sodium itself. It actually comes back to the osmolality that I was talking about before. Now, the reason that the hyponatremia is an issue with osmolality is because sodium, of all the things in our blood and our interstitial fluid, has by far the biggest influence on the osmolality in those parts of our body. So if blood sodium goes low, by definition, osmolality will almost definitely be low as well. Now, we have osmolality on the inside of our cells and on the outside of our cells, including our blood. And sodium is mainly on the outside of the cell. So blood sodium lowers, osmolality lowers there, but it doesn't necessarily change the osmolality on the inside of the cells where potassium predominates rather than sodium. And so water will always move to equalize the osmolality on either side of cell membranes. So basically, if the blood sodium starts to fall, that fluid will shift into the cells and away from the blood. Now, the issue here with hyponatremia is that usually it's associated with excessive fluid intake. So you've drank too much fluid, more than what you've actually lost during exercise, and that's diluted the sodium and then shifted that excess water into the cells, and the cells themselves start to expand. And it's actually the expansion of cells which is the dangerous part. So they can expand in the lungs, that can cause problems, but the most dangerous part is when the cells in your brain start to expand, because your skull obviously is a fixed cavity, your brain doesn't have much room to move in terms of that expansion, and that's where it gets dangerous.
Yeah, and can result in death as a result, can't it? So, okay. Thanks for that explanation. I think it's something that a lot of people talk about and hear the word hyponatremia, but I don't think is very well understood, unfortunately. So can sodium intake prevent or reduce hyponatremia from occurring?
So there's probably a couple of parts to this. Firstly, as I said, the dangerous part of hyponatremia is about the fluid excess. So if you're drinking excessive amounts of fluid, it doesn't matter whether you're taking sodium or not, it's probably not going to help that much. Yes, it will theoretically make the blood sodium less low. It may not stop it being in the hyponatremic range, but it may make it less severe. Theoretically, of the fluid that you do have in the body, that will pull some out of the cells and have less in the cells, so that expansion is less severe. But the issue here is fluid excess in the first place, right? So, yeah, you need to avoid that. I guess where I've sort of looked at is, I guess, the grey area. And what I mean by that is we know that excessive fluid causes blood sodium to drop, and that's a problem. If you drank nothing during exercise for a long time, blood sodium will rise. We talked about that before. So the question is, where's the tipping point? Where does it stop rising and start falling? And is it within the range of where we would traditionally or theoretically want to consume fluid from a health and performance perspective? And so that's some work I did. I think it was published in 2022 or 3, I can't remember now, using some mathematical modeling that comes from actually the hospital setting, but it has been validated during exercise as well. And basically what that showed is that tipping point for people with kind of a normal sweat sodium concentration is around 70%. So once you start replacing about 70% or a bit over 70% of your fluid losses during exercise, your blood sodium will start to drop if that fluid doesn't contain any sodium. So there is this area between sort of 70% replacement and 100%, because we would never recommend replacing more than 100%, where theoretically your blood sodium would potentially start to fall if no sodium was consumed, which would basically, if it starts to fall, you'll probably, theoretically, you should just pee it out rather than retain it, but occasionally you do retain it. But it also causes a shift into the cells rather than staying in the blood, or some of it, not all of it, of course.
Okay, so the take home and hopefully I get this right, it is possible for exercise-associated hyponatremia to occur if fluid intake is not even excessive. If it's more than 70%, between 70 and 100% of fluid loss, if you replace that and there's no sodium in that fluid, then there is the possibility for exercise-associated hyponatremia to occur.
Theoretically.
Yes. Based on the modeling. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think, 70%, I think, okay, what do we recommend to our athletes? Fuel in on the bike, 70 to 80%. We recommend fluid replacement, and then on the run 60-70%, and that is specific to cyclists who are about to run off the bike to try and keep them in a more hydrated state. So there is purpose there. Maybe if you're just a cyclist and you're not actually having to then go into a marathon or a half marathon or a run, you could probably drop that amount down to 60 to 70%. Now we're going to go into what that would look like when we talk about specific recommendations on fluid replacement and sodium replacement after we get through the last rationale. So is there anything you want to add? Yeah. What do you want to add to that before we do that?
I was just going to say, I guess the only thing I'd really add here is that replacing more than 70% is more relevant to ultra endurance type events.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you, where do you put something like 70.3? Do you call that ultra endurance? For the average person taking 5.5 hours?
Yeah. I guess the other way of looking at it is probably something that's more than about 4 to 5 hours. So 70.3 is right on the threshold.
Yeah. Average age grouper is 5.5 hours.
But their sweat rate's probably a bit lower than the pros.
Maybe, yeah, for sure, because their power output is definitely a bit lower. But I think it's so for those athletes, and we're thinking, I can't remember what the average time is for a marathon. I think it's certainly over 4.5 hours for the average punter, and it's actually getting worse. Or I shouldn't say worse; it's getting higher because attendance and participation in marathons isn't limited now to what we would call marathoners. Everyone's having a go, so I think that does play some role in this as well. So that's evidence for sodium intake in that there is probably a role in sodium intake if you are replacing a certain percentage of fluid based on duration of the exercise. What about evidence against sodium intake? Is there any evidence against taking it in?
Not necessarily that it should be avoided in that sense, but more so that it may be unnecessary, I think, is where that rationale comes from. And there has been talk, we actually do store some sodium in various parts of our body. Actually, in our skin is one of them, and in muscle tissue as well. And this is a finding that's been theoretical for a long time, but with the advent of new MRI technology from sort of the early 2000s, we started to be able to image this and actually detect it. And so there was some suggestion that, you don't need to worry about replacing sodium because if you start developing hyponatremia, you just release some of these sodium stores to top it up and you'll be fine. What we see is actually that's not the case because hyponatremia is usually associated with fluid excess, not lack of fluid. And so, in fact, those sodium stores are released in relation to blood volume, not blood concentration or sodium concentration or osmolality, however you want to define it. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it, because if you are overhydrated and then you released a bunch of sodium into the blood, which makes you more likely to retain fluid, that would be a bad thing. And vice versa, if you're becoming dehydrated, you would want to release more sodium to stimulate thirst and fluid retention.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can pretty much say, in regards to rationale for preventing falling blood sodium concentration and hyponatremia, that excessive fluid intake rather than lack of sodium intake is the most common cause of exercise-associated hyponatremia. Sodium replacement still has some influence on sodium plasma concentration, including when fluid is more, completely replaced. Let's call it greater than 70%, less than 100%. So there certainly does appear to be some role in sodium that athletes can rely on when it comes to potentially preventing, if they've got their fluid replacement strategy sort of right or in line with the duration of the exercise. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Last rationale before we get into how we would recommend this based on duration and fluid replacement and stuff like that. Rationale 5, sodium replacement improves exercise performance. This is an interesting one because, as you highlighted, there's very little research on directly performance. I guess the way I think of it is coming back to that complex nature. If, we're recommending sodium because an athlete's cramping and they're not cramping anymore, and maybe it's because of the sodium, the fluids, the carbs, everything like that, then is that considered performance enhancing as a result? I know it's not direct, but where do you sit on that? And I think you had some thoughts around that when you came to the conclusion for this particular rationale.
Yeah. So I guess there's two parts to this. There's a direct effect in the same way that we would think about, carbohydrate and performance or caffeine and performance or whatever it is, and there's an indirect effect. So does having sodium during exercise help something else, and that something else is what actually improves performance? So it's kind of an indirect effect. So this was something that I had a look at actually during my PhD. It wasn't actually part of the PhD. It was a bit of a sort of side quest during that last year of the PhD, where I tried to look at all the studies that have been published. So I did a systematic review on sodium intake and performance, and we could only find 5 studies, I think it was, that had ever been published, and this was 2018, and I don't think really that much has changed since then, to be honest. Looking at sodium.
That's mental, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's absolutely
when you compare
mental.
that to carbohydrate or caffeine, there's a new one every month almost.
Creatine, there's a new one every day at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just mental. And when you think of the the availability and the widespread use of sodium.
And the belief around it.
You would just love to see more evidence, direct evidence.
Yep.
I think the indirect is probably, is there or thereabouts, but, the direct, can it actually be, exercise performance enhancing?
And what really struck me is that there's been so much research on sodium and hyponatremia, on sodium and fluid absorption, on sodium and thirst, on sodium and palatability, like all of the, and sweat sodium losses, like perfecting sweat sodium techniques. How do you get the perfect technique? Do the machines valid? If you put the patch on the arm versus the leg, what is the result? Like so much money and time and effort is going into research on sodium, but literally none of it, or almost none of it, has gone into, well, does it actually matter from a performance perspective?
Do you think that's because it is more the indirect? That's the focus. It's like, because it's not directly having well, I guess that comes back to rationale 3, the direct impact on cramping, but it's, maybe it has an indirect, or it does have a direct impact on that, but the indirect impact is then on performance as a result of not cramping, as opposed to
I think there's probably a few different reasons for it. Some of it comes down to politics and commerce and funding, I suspect. I don't want to sound conspiracy theorist about it, but I guess when you have a group of people that are buying sodium-containing products that have a strong belief that they're going to improve performance, there's no commercial incentive to fund studies to show that it actually does, because then you're only confirming what people already believed anyway, and if it doesn't, then you kind of shot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I would expect that this type of research be conducted by, institutions as opposed to companies selling the product, because, as you say, like, it's probably a no-win situation for them. It either confirms what they already believe, or the worst case would be that it actually just shows that it doesn't improve performance directly. But then I guess the argument against that is it's the indirect benefit of it. And we've never said that sodium directly. I don't see it too often. Maybe I'm just blind to it, but I don't see many statements around sodium is going to improve performance directly.
I don't see direct statements, to be fair. I don't see that. But I think that belief is well entrenched in a lot of athletes.
Yeah.
But
maybe that's a misunderstanding.
Correct.
They misunderstand that it's a direct improvement to performance, but it's actually the indirect improvement to performance, which they just get misaligned in the terminology, maybe more so than and maybe that's where the misunderstanding and the belief comes from.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
5 studies.
A bit of an aside.
5 studies. But I think it's so important, because it's like, you just want people to be able to understand and explain why they're taking sodium in as well. And I think that's what this study did well, is like, think about why you're going to take the sodium in, because it clearly does have an impact and can have a positive impact in certain areas before exercise, during exercise, and we'll talk about after exercise. But think about and understand why you're doing something as opposed to just doing it.
Yeah.
I think that, like, what was it? Simon Sinek? Is that his name?
Yeah.
Just ask why, or why, whatever the book, I can't remember what the book was called, but it's like, always ask that question, why? Why are you doing it? And then I think it opens you up to, maybe I don't actually understand, and maybe I need to actually dive a little bit deeper into this to get an understanding on it. But then again, as we've talked about many times, some people don't give a shit about the why and just tell me the how and what, and I'll do it. And I understand that as well. People are busy these days. So, 5 studies. What did they show you?
Yeah, so 5 studies, 4 of them didn't show any effect of sodium on performance. 1 showed an 8% improvement in performance, which is much larger than what you'd see with caffeine or carbohydrate or anything like that. So that was kind of interest to me. I'm like, wow, well, there's this huge effect here, but nothing else has seen any effect. So I had to look into it, and it was a study done during an actual 70.3 race. And they basically got a bunch of people and gave half of them placebo capsules and half of them salt capsules. And other than that, just said, do your thing, and then looked at the finish times. in the race, and the group that had the salt capsules actually consumed a lot more fluid than the group that didn't. So, we were talking before about driving thirst and driving more fluid intake. It did in this study by, I think it was over 200 mils an hour from memory throughout the 70.3. The fluid intake was self-reported, so how accurate it is hard to know for sure. But it is literally the only study to date in an endurance sports context that's shown an effect of sodium on performance. And I would say my interpretation of that is it probably did so because they drank more fluid, and that fluid was required and actually improved their hydration status as a result. So as you said before, it's an indirect effect here. So sodium may have an effect on performance if it drives you to drink an amount of fluid that is more appropriate. So not over-consuming fluid, but just consuming adequate fluid where you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, and that's the key takeaway here, isn't it? The fluid intake is greater as a result of the sodium intake. And that's a good one.
But and if we look at studies where they've just fixed the intensity, like the 5-hour one we were talking about before, and there are others as well, what you see there is no difference in any of the measures that might hint at a performance benefit. So no differences in body temperature, no benefit, differences in perceived exertion, no differences in heart rate or any of those sort of factors where you'd say, okay, well, based on these, we would hypothesize a performance difference. You don't see them.
Yeah, which is fascinating as well. I think in that 5-hour study, there was a hint, wasn't there, that the higher sodium intake had a positive impact on plasma volume? It was starting to trend in that direction, and we don't know because it obviously did 5 hours.
Yeah, but it didn't translate into anything that might suggest a performance improvement in terms of RPE or heart rate or body temperature. And actually, we've seen that in previous research. It seems to be the total amount of water in the body rather than whether it's in the blood or not that seems to be most impactful from a performance point of view.
Yeah. So, I just think of things like Ironman where the duration is going to be at least double that. And what would that result in? And as you said, it might be the total body water content that has the biggest driver, and does sodium therefore impact that? I guess, until someone does that study and put someone on 10 hours continuous, I guess, we probably won't know, will we? Okay. So let's go into the last part. How should we make sodium replacement recommendations during exercise? And I think this is the big one, isn't it? This is probably what people really want to know and understand. And we've hinted at it. So can you explain what we've seen in total body sodium loss to date in the research? And what the implications are.
So I think traditionally the way people have thought about this, and not just athletes, but coaches, practitioners even to a large extent, have thought about sodium as this, there's a certain amount of sodium in your body. And if you lose a lot of it and you don't replace it, then something bad is going to happen when it falls below a certain amount. So kind of thinking a bit like muscle glycogen, for example, as a store of carbohydrate, they've thought about sodium in that way. We can't see any evidence to date that that's the case. Now, obviously, if someone loses, 50% of their body sodium stores, that probably will be a problem. But, our 5-hour study, that was one of the things that we were specifically looking at, was how far could we push that sodium deficit during exercise, and were we going to see anything as a result? And so we got them to, I think it was an 8% sodium deficit. So in other words, they'd lost 8% of the entire sodium in their body from start to end of that 5 hours, and we didn't see any difference to the people who literally lost 0 sodium during exercise.
How much did that equate to in terms of milligrams?
About 5,500.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot. And no difference. So, because I think people, as you come back to some of those earlier rationales of the fear of not replacing sodium, it's that total body sodium is going to go down so much that's going to cause all these problems. But actually, when you're showing 5,000 or 6,000 milligrams of sodium are lost with no change, then if the fluid balance is not, if the fluid intake isn't addressed, then maybe the sodium loss isn't such an issue.
So the other way of looking at it is the relationship, as we've talked about, between water and sodium. And I guess they will eventually kind of interact when the duration of exercise becomes long enough anyway, because if you get into a massive sodium deficit after 15 or 20 hours, so instead of 5,500 milligram deficit, you're talking, 10 or 20,000 milligram deficit, you're going to start to run into issues in terms of hyponatremia and things like that probably anyway. In that situation, we haven't been able to measure it to date, but theoretically that's likely. So the way I've sort of thought about it and spent a lot of time thinking about what's the practical message we can take out of all of this and keep it as simple as we can, because unfortunately it is a complex relationship between water and sodium. It's not like we can say, well, if your sweat sodium concentration is this many milligrams per litre, just drink that, or 50% of that, or 80% of that. The relationship, unfortunately, doesn't work in a simple linear way like that. So in that paper, I've built this sort of table in there that sort of recommends that for the maintenance of blood sodium concentration. In other words, you first look up how much fluid are you going to replace as a percentage of your losses. That's the sort of 70% we talked about earlier. It could be more, it could be less. What is your sweat sodium concentration? So from a sweat sodium test, put those two things together, and based on that, how much sodium do you actually need to replace? So like 50% of your losses, 20% of your losses, 90% of your losses, whatever it is, to maintain a stable balance between fluid and sodium in the body. And I think even if you aren't doing it specifically for the prevention of hyponatremia, if you follow that approach, it means that the more water you lose and therefore replace during exercise, the more sodium you're going to take in anyway. And so it is going to cover you off against that total body sodium loss if it could theoretically get to the, 10 or 20,000 milligrams over, 15, 20 hours of exercise anyway.
You had 3 really good questions, I think, which I thought were really smart. And can you just how should athletes be thinking about, or coaches, anyone, practitioners, recommending sodium and fluid intake? What specifically are those 3 questions that if they were to answer yes to them, what does that then, what sort of does that impact for the athlete?
Yeah. So basically the 3 questions are getting at what are those scenarios where theoretically blood sodium could fall, therefore sodium replacement would be a good idea. The idea is if you answer no to all of these, it's not to say you should avoid sodium, but simply that the amount of sodium probably doesn't matter very much. And so it's more just about personal taste preferences and what's going to encourage you to optimize your nutrition in other ways. But I guess coming to those questions, again, using that 70% cutoff that we talked about before for the average person, it might be a little bit lower, about 60 to 65% if you're a really salty sweater, and up around the 80 to 90% mark if you've got a really low sweat sodium concentration, but 70% covers the vast majority of people. So basically the 3 questions are, would the athlete actually benefit from drinking or replacing more than 70% of their fluid losses during exercise? And as I said before, that very much depends on the total amount of sweat, so both the sweat rate and the duration of exercise. Generally speaking, anything under 4 hours of exercise, the answer is always going to be no. So there's a flow chart in the paper which basically says you don't even need to ask these questions. If your event is less than 4 hours, you don't even need to begin with this.
Okay.
But if it's over 4 hours, then yes. So would the athlete benefit from replacing more than 70%? You can do calculations to figure that out. But also, could the athlete tolerate drinking more than 70% fluid? So even theoretically, if they would benefit from it, is it actually going to be achievable from a gastrointestinal comfort point of view? And so for me, most people, that limit is probably going to be somewhere around 1,200 to maybe 1,400 mils an hour. It seems to be the upper limit that people struggle to drink more than that. There are exceptions, particularly some pro athletes, larger pro athletes that can go higher than that, but most people would struggle. And so that's about 70% of about 1.8 litres an hour. So again, if you're sweating more than 1.8 litres an hour, chances are you're not going to be able to drink enough to drop your blood sodium concentration. You are going to become somewhat dehydrated during exercise. Your blood sodium is going to rise anyway, so that rationale for replacing lots of sodium is kind of a moot point because your blood sodium is already going up. So that's the second part. And then I guess the third part is it actually practical within the rules and the context of your sport or event to actually replace more than 70%? And I guess what I'm getting at there is, can you actually access that much fluid on course depending on whether you can physically carry it with you or you're reliant on aid stations. And if so, do you have to slow down so much to get that much fluid that it's actually a competitive disadvantage to do so anyway? So they're all the sort of practical things that you have to consider.
So how should we be thinking about recommended sodium and fluid intake? There's 3 questions athletes should be asking themselves. Number 1, would you, the athlete, benefit from replacing greater than 70% of your fluid losses in your training session or event? Number 2, can you, the athlete, tolerate drinking enough fluids to replace greater than 70% of their losses during their training session or your event? And number 3, is it actually practical within the rules and the limitations of the sport for you, the athlete, to replace 70% of your fluid losses during that training session or the event? And only when you answer yes to all 3 of these questions does it appear the case for such levels of fluid replacement that therefore theoretically there is a need for sodium replacement beyond simply seasoning to taste. So our short-term versus endurance exercise and what athletes, practitioners should be thinking about. And so I was thinking about this from a fuel in perspective. On the bike, we recommend athletes 70 to 80% of fluid replacement for their losses. And then for running, it's around that 60 to 70%. I think you mentioned around the duration, and in that beautiful flow chart you've got, you talk about the 4 hours. I guess the thing that we have talked about internally, and we do talk about this with athletes, is when their training sessions are less than that 4 hours, but they're training for an event that goes over 4 hours. And that's always the tricky one and probably very difficult to actually to display or depict on a flow chart, because certainly in my experience, I will still recommend athletes to replace and get used to consuming 70 to 80% on the bike, even if the session is, between 1 and 2 hours or less than 4 hours, just to practice for training. Where do you, just your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, look, it's basically a form of gut training, isn't it?
Yeah,
to
exactly.
prepare yourself for an event, because if you try to do that on race day and you haven't done it in the past, it may become difficult. I think it is helpful to do. I don't think it needs to be done every single time you train necessarily.
Correct.
And it depends on the time in your season as well. Like if you're just starting out at early in the season, base training and things, probably not such an issue. But as you get closer to race day, it starts to become more important to do that. I guess the other thing to think of is context here is, if it's 70% of what. So what I would be thinking about rather than 70%, because if you're training in the cold of winter for a hot race, well, 70% of a really low sweat rate is not going to be much fluid anyway, as opposed to 70% of what you lose in Kona, which could be quite a large amount. So what I'd be thinking about is actually, what is my fluid requirement for Kona? Working that out, and then using that as a benchmark for gut training, just in mils per hour, whatever that happens to be. The thing is, obviously, if it is very cold and you then that could end up in over-consuming fluid in some of those conditions where you're doing easy training sessions in cold environments. So that does become challenging.
Yeah, and you may need to just adjust the temperature in the room, if you're in, again, northern hemisphere, or layer up and just get that sweat rate going up as a result.
Yep.
And you've got to, and that's again how we do it in Fuel In, is it's specific to the temperature less than 26 Celsius or above 26, and important for athletes to recognize that, because lower temperatures, you're going to have a lower sweat rate, and you certainly don't want to be consuming your fluid intake for Kona in 19 degrees sort of weather. So if we look at some modeling, and like I went through this, and let's talk about on the bike. So let's say someone has a concentration of 40 millimoles per liter, which by my understanding is around 1,000 milligrams per liter. Yep. So based on this, for 70% fluid replaced, if you did replace 70%, you would actually have a 0% amount of sodium requirement to be replaced. Is that correct? Based on that modelling?
So I haven't got it in front of me, but that sounds right.
Yeah. I'm
At
pretty sure I
70%.
did it that way. So that was based on 70%. If someone did replace 80%, however, that would be roughly a 30% of that sodium loss being replaced, and that would equate to, therefore, 300 milligrams per litre.
Yep.
Okay. Now let's go down to the next person. So now we're getting into the sort of moderately salty sweaters. I think we can call them 50 millimoles or 1150 milligrams per litre. Again, 70% fluid loss or fluid replacement would require, modeled on yours, around a 12% sodium replacement, which equates to around 140, 150 milligrams per litre. So very low amounts. If that athlete was replacing 80% of their fluid losses, then they would require roughly 43% of their sodium to be replaced, which again puts them at around that 500 milligrams per litre. So I guess, and a lot of athletes might be thinking, oh yeah, I replace around 500 milligrams per litre. I guess the question for you is, are you replacing around 80% of your fluid lost? And if you're not, you may just be taking in a bit too much sodium based on that modelling. That's correct.
Just taking a step back again, I think there might be a bit of confusion here. We might want to re-record this bit. Okay. Because the milligrams per litre of sodium, is it milligrams per litre of sweat lost or milligrams per litre of fluid consumed?
It was milligrams of sweat loss, I believe, based on...
Yeah.
Is that right?
This is where I probably convert it into milligrams per hour of sodium loss, and then take a percentage of that as the amount to replace. And you can then back convert that to milligrams per litre of fluid consumed. But obviously that amount consumed may go up and down. And this is where it gets into, I was mentioning before, that sort of philosophical discussion about whether you have a fixed amount of sodium to help drive the thirst to improve the fluid, or do you allow the sodium to go up and down as the fluid goes up and down?
Okay, so if we're thinking about this, and we'll just give one example of an athlete, and let's say, our general recommendation of fuel in is around 70 to 80% of fluid replacement on the bike. And that's usually typically because an athlete is going to be running off the bike in terms of a triathlete, and we don't want them to be dehydrated going into the run. If someone has like an estimated sort of, 40 millimole per litre or a sweat sodium concentration of 1,000 milligrams per litre, how would we then be thinking about how much sodium to replace based on that sort of 70 to 80% fluid replacement rule?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, it's not an easy sort of one-size-fits-all number or equation that we can use here, unfortunately, just because of the relationship between sodium and fluid, which is why in the paper there's a table so you can look this up. So what you've described there is the fluid replacement and the sweat sodium concentration. So they're two parts. That's the columns and the rows in the table, and then the middle of the table will give you the answer based on the more complex equation that you have to do to figure that out. So if you were replacing 70% of fluid losses and you had a sweat sodium concentration of, just under 1,000 milligrams per litre, you don't really need to replace any sodium to maintain a stable blood sodium concentration. Now, you may
if you're taking in 70% of fluid.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, you may choose to have some sodium. It's not saying you should avoid sodium necessarily, but it's just saying you don't have to have a specific amount based on a sweat test or anything like that. So you can adjust what's in your drinks and things to improve the taste of them and do whatever there. Yeah. If that increased to, you're now having to replace 80% of your fluid losses, then yes, you would start to theoretically need some sodium to stop that blood sodium starting to fall. But the amount is quite small. If you look up the table, it's about 30% sodium replacement. So you're losing 1,000 milligrams per litre. But yeah, you don't need a huge amount. Only 30% of that, so 300 milligrams per litre of fluid loss. Depends on how much you're losing per hour, of course, what the actual sweat rate is.
Well,
so you've got to do that first.
And that's what we were saying, wasn't it? Is like you've then got to work out what and again, through repeated sweat rate testing, you would gain an understanding. And in this case, let's call it the athlete has 700 mils per hour, which is pretty common. What would that equate to? If they've got a loss of 700 milliliters of water as an estimate per hour, where would
then they're going to be losing 700 milligrams of sodium per hour.
And then a 30% replacement of that would equate to
210 milligrams an hour.
Just over 200 milligrams per hour. So
Not
a whole lot. Maybe, in a lot of these products will have, gels, the carbohydrate solutions will often have some sodium in them. So you may not need to be adding extra sodium in if those products you're consuming are carbohydrate only and you're replacing 80% of your fluid intake. Then yes, the addition of some sodium would be recommended, but it's not going to need to be excessive. That's pretty much the take home from this.
Very easy, achievable.
Yeah, very achievable. And look, I think with all of this, it's a model. There's then going to be individuals that require more sodium or less sodium based on then fluid intake and carbohydrate intake and how they're feeling. But I think it's just at least a nice framework for athletes to start to think about how their sweat sodium concentration testing actually relates to the levels that may be required to take in. And obviously we gave a I think a fairly moderate sweat sodium concentration of 1,000 milligrams per liter as an example. As that amount goes up, obviously the percentage of sodium to be replaced goes up as well, in line with the fluid replacement. But it's just something to think about. And I think we'll probably maybe go over that a little bit more in episode 3. And we'll also do some social media sort of explanations on that athletes can review. Perfect. Al, I know a lot of numbers, a lot of detail thrown in. I will refer athletes and anyone listening to this to the paper. You've got a lovely table there where you can quickly go through and work out sort of, based on sweat rate, fluid replacement and sweat sodium concentrations and the percentage of what you might require. And then after that is a very nice flow chart depicting, duration of exercise, sweat rate, or percentage of fluid replacement, and then sweat sodium concentration testing amounts and where that would leave you. And it's a lovely flow chart, very simple to understand. And again, we will do a really nice discussion on that on social media so athletes can see that clearly what we're referring to. Al, is there anything else you want to add before we close this one off and then we head to session 3 or episode 3 on after exercise and future research?
Look, I think the key thing from all of this and examining all these rationales and the evidence for or against them is overwhelmingly where we come to with all of this is that sodium replacement during exercise is about complementing what you're doing from a hydration point of view, as in the fluid ins and outs, and it's not about sodium stores and trying to replace a certain amount of sodium stores. And that's probably the shift in thinking I think we can potentially benefit from. And I guess it's then thinking, okay, well, if we're thinking about sodium during exercise, we can't think about that independently or until we've figured out what we're doing from a fluid perspective first, because the fluid is then going to dictate what we need to do from a sodium perspective as well.
Yeah, beautifully said. And with that, mate, we'll sign off and I'll catch you for episode 3 just around the corner.
Will do.
Thanks, Al.